how
Let's
things
start.
stand right now. So I think we should start. So thank you, everyone. Seema, Seema's already started recording. Seema, could you also start the live?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's started already.
Yeah, all right. So thank you everyone for joining, despite the pandemic, the second wave, and I know a lot of people who are in India are probably under stress because of that. But we hopefully the next hour or so, hour and a half, we'll try and think through some issues on housing with Dr. Kaveri Haritas. Thank you, Kaveri, for agreeing to talk with us today. Kaveri is going to talk about citizenship in Limbo and analysis of rehabilitation housing. She's an associate professor at the Jindal School of Government and Public Policy, and doctoral research is on rehabilitation housing. And I believe there is a book soon in the offing, and I hope you also tell us a little bit about that, Kaveri, when you're talking to us. As usual, I'll hand over to you. You have 45 minutes to talk to us, and after that, we'll invite questions. Those who've joined us today, please feel free to put your questions either in the Q&A box or in the chat. When the time comes for questioning, we'll open up your audio, and I mean, it's a webinar interface, so we can't have everyone on video, but we'll definitely open up your audio so we can have more of an interactive conversation. So over to you, Kaveri, and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I also see Christine in the audience. Christine was my thesis guide. Thank you, Christine, for joining us at such short notice. Good afternoon. I really thank you for this occasion to sort of present a little part of my forthcoming book, In Search of Home. This book is based on an ethnographic research that I conducted for my PhD at the Graduate Institute at Geneva. I want to thank the Swiss National Science Foundation for its generous funding that made this research possible. I also want to thank Christine for pretty much holding my hand during this ethnography. I learned ethnography thanks to her. I would also like to take this moment to thank the people who have read the book and have also endorsed it. First of all, Veronique Dupont, Pushpa Arabindu, and Julia Eckert. Would I be able to sort of, share a PPT screen, because there are a couple of images and perhaps a PPT itself that I could share. Would that be possible?
Yes, of course. You can share your screen. Yes.
Okay. Okay, great. I'm doing that now. All right. Okay. So before I sort of begin can you see the screen now?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So before I begin my presentation,
can you make it full screen, please? Because we can also see the.
Okay.
Just the usual way you do it in PowerPoint, when you go to the bottom and press the full screen tab.
Oh, yes, of course. Yeah.
Okay.
Here goes. Can you see that?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to first give you a context to this book and how I decided to actually begin on this ethnography. First of all, a note on the crisis, the housing crisis that we are facing. As per the 2011 census, we had a shortage of 18.78 million homes. With about 99% of this shortage felt by the economically weaker sections and low-income groups. There has been an inequitable allocation of land for housing. For instance, in Karnataka, there are more than 11 million vacant homes in urban areas belonging primarily to middle-income and high-income groups. But despite this, you see the state government allocating a lot more land towards housing these groups. as against the low-income groups and weaker sections. The states are not providing housing because they are not mandated by law to do so. Of course, we have the directive principles of state policy, but they are not enforceable. India does not recognize the right to shelter or housing as a fundamental right. But it's essentially a policy decision that is open to states. On the other hand, what you see is obviously with the lack of affordable housing, people have to settle somewhere, and you have slums and settlements. There's a lot of migration into cities. But on the other hand, you also see a sort of a quiet displacement of the urban poor taking place, and a spatial rearrangement of these cities. The Housing and Land Rights Network has recently, since 2017, been collecting data on these displacements. For instance, in 2017, it was 2.6 lakh people who were displaced, and 77% of the displacement projects were for city beautification projects. In 2018, more than 2 lakh people were displaced, and 47% of this was for slum clearance or evictions. So in a certain sense, rehabilitation housing is a policy initiative, but on the other hand, it's also discouraged by the judiciary. As we saw in the Almitra Patel case, for instance, the Supreme Court clearly says that it's not a good thing to do to rehabilitate the poor because it encourages violation of law. Affordable housing, on the other hand, that is provided under central government schemes. And here, during my research, I studied the JNNURM rehabilitation housing that was provided primarily. And even under the Rajiv Awas Yojana, which I've been reading up on after my research, are directed towards rehabilitation housing, that is towards housing the people who are evicted from within the city. There is also a trend, a dominant trend. For instance, notified slums and again, very few of those notified slums are selected for in-situ housing projects with a PPP arrangement, that is public-private partnership arrangement. Most of the slums, there is a preference for resettlement housing in the peripheries of the city. So therefore, you see new sites of urban poverty emerging in the landscape of cities. And you also see, in a certain sense, rehabilitation housing enabling the displacement of the poor from the center of cities to its margins. These are the pictures I wanted to show before I decide, maybe I think I will stop sharing after this because this is really what I wanted to show. These are a couple of pictures from the area that I worked in. It's called Lagere. These are the Lagere, they're commonly referred to as the slum board quarters in Lagere. They're situated in the west of Bangalore. This is essentially a 54-acre plot of land controlled by the Karnataka Slum Development Board. And as of 2009, I was told that there were about 4,000 families housed in this area. From my initial research, I realized that, in fact, most of these families had come into the area on eviction from slums in other parts of the city. During my research between 2009 and 2015, there was also a further densification of the area, more buildings coming up, and a lot more people from slums and settlements in other parts who were relocated here. Just also a note on my, research. I studied about 50 families, actually more than 50 families. It was about 55 families. And finally, I had to discard about 5 families for various reasons. People who died, people who moved out. So 50 families who were followed up between 2009 and 2015. These were, essentially follow-up interviews during my research, meaning that each time I went back to the field, I visited the field about 4 times during my PhD research and once after the defense of my thesis. So each time I would go back, I would interview the same group of families. So in that sense, it was a longitudinal research. And apart from residents who lived there, the families, women, men, sometimes even older children that I interviewed, I also interviewed the local slum board officials, one urban poor organization which had its office in the area, activists and lawyers working with that organization, as well as a couple of NGOs working in the area. My research, my book essentially focuses on the politics of the poor, examining mobilizations for rehabilitation housing, as well as the politics that unfurls post-rehabilitation in these spaces like Lagere. At the first level, my work contributes to a better understanding of the political economy of rehabilitation housing, the corruption that takes place, in which both officials as well as middlemen and mediators of various sorts are involved in, and the manner in which this shapes urban poor struggles, the opportunities that it affords them, as well as the manner in which it limits these struggles on the ground. At a second level, I explore the legal status of the rehabilitated poor, contrasting the promise of home ownership with what actually takes place here, with the realities of living in these areas, and the texture of citizenship in these new spaces of legal exception. In my exploration, I have emphasized the gendered underbelly of the politics of the poor, primarily because there's very little work on gender and the politics of the poor. But also because it surfaced at various stages of my research, and I could see the manner in which women were putting in political work of certain sorts, and also the auto assumption of certain roles by both men and women, and the manner in which they negotiate with the state and the strategic employment of gender at various points to evoke a certain state paternalism. I will, of course, not have the time to discuss all of this today, so I will focus my presentation primarily on what happens to the rehabilitated poor and their dreams of home ownership in this presentation. Poor groups are recruited into desires of home ownership. It's actually the reason why most of them decide to leave prime plots of land and jobs within the city to relocate into these areas. Even when they stand a very good chance at staying put. In one interview with a lawyer who worked with one of these urban poor organizations that I researched in this group in this study, told me how in one case there was this group which had a very good chance at staying put, at claiming adverse possession for the land because they had occupied it for decades. And he advised them not to accept rehabilitation housing, but that overnight this group was convinced by other people, primarily by mediators and middlemen of various sorts, to accept rehabilitation housing. But what I also found in interviews with these newly rehabilitated poor was when I asked them, why is it that you decided to take this up? Wouldn't you want to explore these legal avenues available? There are many groups who are able to stay put and are able to, after a lot of mobilization, get access to in situ housing. People essentially spoke of how they had these desires of owning a home in the city. In Kannada, they would say, having a swanta money. And this played a very important part in their decisions to vacate and accept rehabilitation housing. So they came in thinking that somehow they would be legal citizens of the city and that they do not have to, therefore, continue to endure this threat of eviction and the vulnerabilities that this poses to them. But life in Lagere was very far from what they imagined. Here I'd like to separate the two groups. The older people, I mean, people who were allotted housing in the 1980s, spoke of the area as completely undeveloped. It was almost forest-like. There was absolutely nothing, no roads, no streets, just houses in the middle of nowhere with crumbling walls. In the case of new allottees, I also had the chance of witnessing what they went through when they were given these housing, essentially homes without services, neither electricity nor water. So groups would have to sort of illegally mobilize these services. Groups would, tap into electric poles nearby, risking sometimes their own lives in doing this. Tapping into water secretly with underground water pipes and purchasing water when that wasn't available or when these taps were removed. Organizing drainage privately on themselves, by themselves, collecting money, getting somebody to come and clean the drains. And waste was essentially thrown in the open and very rarely removed. So just like in a slum, I observed that it takes these residents several years to obtain electricity connections, which they do so with some amount of political maneuvering. But with the case with water connections, it's much, much more complicated, as many groups are not willing to pay for this water. And then they settle for shared access to public taps installed by the local councillor and operated generally by the councillor's men. I have discussed this a little more in detail in an earlier paper titled Troubled Waters. What you also see in this area is that much like in slums, vote banking continues to take place in these areas, and the slum board also sort of very closely governs these areas. And here in Lagere, it even has an office in the area. Residents, therefore, in a certain sense, feel suspended between the slum and their dreams of home ownership. Though they are now legal residents, the poor quality of housing, the lack of services, the constant dependence on both the councillors as well as on the slum board officials makes it seem like it is closer to a slum than a home of their own, not close to what they imagined that they would be getting in these new spaces. It's also perhaps the reason why residents referred to Lagere rehabilitation area as a slum board quarters, linking the word slum with quarters. Now, essentially, quarters is a residential area provided by public institutions to state officials or staff. Therefore, in a sense, they allude both to the slum-like life in these spaces, as well as the control of the state through the slum board over these areas. Even while life seems very slum-like in these spaces, the rehabilitated poor differ from slum dwellers in terms of their legal status. Allotments provide them legal residence, and they also have a waiting period after which they can apply for ownership, for titles, that is the khata, to their houses. But what actually happens is that ownership never materializes. Now, there are several reasons why this happens. And most important of these is, one is the form of the housing, and as well as the poor quality of housing in these areas. Homes that were built in the 1980s in Lagere were crumbling, the roofs were crumbling, they were so dilapidated that they were already earmarked for reconstruction, for demolition and reconstruction. So the poor realized that if they gain ownership of these apartments, it's a huge financial burden on them. It's a liability because they're unable to maintain these apartments, forget about demolition or reconstruction, given how poorly they have been built. So they prefer to stay allottees and rely on the slum board for demolition and reconstruction of these apartments. But this has, as you can imagine, its own set of consequences because they've become embroiled in relations of dependence on the slum board. Now, the slum board also profits from the situation, gains substantially from the situation, because it retains control of this plot of land and the homes within it. And on dilapidation, it replaces smaller buildings with much larger, more floors, bigger, buildings with more homes. The same housing is then allotted to new entrants coming into the area, or those who might have either rented or leased that house in the absence of the original owner. This therefore sort of, results in a suspension of the rehabilitated poor, because on the one hand, they have legal residence, but they're still continually dependent on the slum board. And are therefore, in a sense, unable to exercise full control over their homes, over their so-called properties. Apart from this, there is an uncertainty of legal status due to the varied legal positions of allottees. New allotments and people who've been newly allotted homes have allotment letters because they were asked to pay up the entire, their part of the price of construction of the housing in the very beginning. But old allotments under older schemes were provided conditional allotments, but conditional on payment of monthly, sums of money which they were asked to pay. Many of these people have obviously defaulted in these payments, and they therefore had a certain uncertainty about the future. They didn't know whether they would be able to retain their homes or not, because under the policy documents, under these regulations, they are liable to be evicted because of defaults in payments, or they will be asked to repay that amount with interest on them, which most of them could not afford. There are also residents who purchased the homes or have rented the homes from other allottees. These people too were very uncertain of retaining their homes. So there was a general sense of insecurity. So much so that many people would mistake me for a state official, and the first thing they would do was remove a piece of paper to show me that they had a valid allotment. There was also sort of a general fear that at some point the slum board would come in and take them out of their housing. So this sort of uncertainty resulted in many of these people treating these homes as transition homes. They would not invest in the maintenance of these homes, in the upkeep of these homes, for the primary reason that they were not very certain about their own legal status and of retaining these homes. Demolitions and reconstructions considerably add to this uncertainty. Because the slum board, very much like in slums, where it depends on leaders to prepare allotment lists for rehabilitation housing. Similarly, in these areas too, it depends on local leaders to prepare allotment lists in cases of demolition and reconstruction. Therefore, the political support that one has in the area and the allotment status that one has in the area is extremely crucial. I can see a comment
Go on. Questions will keep coming.
Okay. All right. All right. Okay. So in a certain sense, there is, there is a certain, especially groups who don't have good political configurations, who might have fought with a local leader. So there's a deep uncertainty of whether these people will again get the chance to reclaim. Even people who have completely paid up their share of the cost of construction of their homes, even with the allotments, there is a high uncertainty of what will take place post-demolition. So what I observed is that groups were also mobilizing with local leaders as well as urban poor leaders outside the area to once again represent them before the slum board for the fear that they would lose their homes. This fear is so much that groups didn't vacate these homes despite the fact that they were served notice in 2009. It wasn't until 2012 when they were really sure that they would get allotments that they actually vacated these homes. This therefore in a certain sense suspends the rehabilitated poor who despite their so-called legal right to possess these homes are still very anxious and share the same kind of fears of being removed from their homes as slum dwellers do. Now the other thing is that also these homes are sold in the open market. Each home is valued at more than 2 lakh rupees in the open market, and there are also these sales of these homes which take place both by leaders as well as officials who have unofficial quotas. So there is also that fear that maybe a leader would bump off somebody's name off the list and put in someone else's name because they're getting money in return for it. So just as slum residents mobilize for rehabilitation housing on eviction, you see the same sort of mobilization taking place for re-allotments of the very same homes that they were allotted. In Lagere, in fact, one part of Lagere, there were these allotted plots of land where people were not provided this apartment homes, but given small plots of land. And here what I observed is that these neighborhoods are more or less absorbed within the fabric of the city. They lose all markers of the slum areas. I mean, they have their own constructions, they build more floors, they have their khata and all the other documents, they've paid up their money. And so these plot owners were able to sort of integrate with the rest of the citizens in the city. Whereas the ones in this sort of apartment housing were suspended. The impossibility of ownership puts these people into a permanent state of dependence, and the flexible governance that takes place in these areas and political negotiations through which allotments are reviewed at various points in time adds a lot to this uncertainty. Much therefore depends on political networks and political affiliations, not just with leaders in the area, but also within the slum board. So allotments can always be cancelled. There are some cases in which allotments were cancelled, and residents therefore are in fear that their allotments would be cancelled at some point in time. And so this leads to a sort of a permanence of temporariness with all of these people plunged into waiting of various sorts. Now the 50 families that I followed were waiting for documents of various sorts over the 6 years. Some of them were waiting for their identity papers, some for allotment letters. The slum board actually issues first, even before the allotment letter, a small identity card on handing over possession. So they were looking for that. Some were waiting for the demolition of their homes and the reconstruction. Some were waiting for, possession post reconstruction. So through those 6 years, I saw these 50 families at various points plunged into waiting of various sorts. They are therefore, in a sense, in limbo. And here I borrowed these words "in limbo" from the work of Pushpa Arabindu and Lalita Kamath in their description of rehabilitation areas to sort of describe this state of suspension. In proposing that citizenship in rehabilitation areas is in limbo, I draw from both political and legal sociology and anthropology. Anupama Roy, for instance, points out that ownership of land or property remains integral to citizenship even today, reflecting the archaic principle of property ownership as an entitlement to citizenship. She points to the creation of residual citizens as migrants from other parts of the country who are cast outside the elite domain of civil society for being deficient in acumen, capacity, and skills of citizenship. This allows me to some extent to explain why, despite being legal residents, because they've moved away from their illegal status, they're now legal residents, how despite this, the impossibility of home ownership results in them being kept within this category of residual citizens by the state, which deals with them in similar ways in which it deals with the slum dwellers. Here, I also find useful Partha Chatterjee's proposition that citizens are differentiated by the state between proper citizens who possess rights, having a legal title to the property they possess, and though they may not be entitled to compensation, that they are still at some point entitled to state assistance of some sort. And this is what I see happening in these areas where the manner in which the state engages with the poor is not in the sense of rights, but it's more in the sense of an assistance or some sort of welfare mechanism. The rehabilitated poor, therefore, don't really become full citizens by virtue of gaining legal residence. This is also reflected in the anxieties of many in the area, especially those who are a little, upwardly mobile, who especially in families where there are, both the man and the woman, there are two income earners. You see there is a desire to sort of, purchase either a plot of land or to rent a house in a decent area. And that's the manner in which people talk of it, is that I would like to go to a decent area and not live in the slum board quarters. So in a certain sense, there is this, even the manner in which people talk about Lagere itself, there is a sense of it still being very much a slum, of not having left that behind. The rehabilitated poor are therefore in limbo because of these informal arrangements and because of this impossibility of ownership. And the fact that these informal arrangements also take the place of a clearly well-defined law with clearly enunciated rights, which are actionable in a court of law. Unlike those who are allocated plots of land, who sort of become absorbed in the city and become therefore eligible to applying under the regular laws as other people, the people within these zones seem to be subject to what Benda Beckman calls the unnamed law. She defines this as sets of rules, principles and procedures that run parallel to and are often different from the legal system. But this unnamed law is not isolated from the state law. As I observed in my research, the decisions of the slum board were at many points in conflict with policy law, that is, with the regulations of the various schemes under which these allotments were made. Which clearly prohibited renting or sale arrangements. Officials instead recognize these arrangements, in a certain sense conferring rights, certain rights on them, revealing a certain conformity with the formal law, with the state law. As Eckert points out, these normative practices reflect a common sense idea of justice, an eclectic mix of norms, often including everyday understandings of the state, legal norms. She notes that these situational negotiation of norms often have as their normative horizon the state legal norms and are therefore often in parallel rather than in conflict with state laws. Lagere is thus governed through these unnamed and unwritten laws with normative practices over the years giving rise to certain principles of allocation that seem to mimic the state law. And while there is a certain predictability to the actions taken by the slum board, there is no recourse beyond the slum board. This is therefore contributing to the sense of being suspended between the free reign of the state over slums and settlements and state law. I therefore propose that what we see here is citizenship in limbo. And by this, I don't mean that this is a different sort or different type of citizenship. Rather, what I refer to is the indefinite suspension of citizenship. While I examine, the governance of Lagere, in my book, I've also paid attention to the citizenship practices that emanate from within these new spaces. In this last bit, I want to give you a sort of a peek into the next chapter after the one on citizenship. In response to being suspended, in response to this position of limbo that people experience in Lagere, residents very quickly realigned their desires of home ownership through political struggles for reclaiming their neighborhoods. Older residents who witnessed a steady stream of newcomers, of people evicted from slums and settlements from other parts, began to negotiate homes for their children, beginning in 2009 with the announcement of the demolitions of some of these buildings. But what I want to sort of speak to you today about is one specific event that took place in 2012, which gives us a sense of how people resist the state, the slum board, but also points to the conflicts that can emerge in the governance of these areas. Between 2009 and 12, in my interviews with two municipal councillors, the Lagere slum area is actually divided between these two councillors. They spoke of how they were responsible for providing services and responding to the needs of the people in this area. But on the other hand, they were excluded by the slum board in decisions on allotments made within this area, which they felt was within their area and they needed to have a say in it. Both of them spoke about corruption within the slum board, of the role of mediators in bringing in, slum dwellers from other parts of the city. And they spoke of how the slum board did not respond to the demands of their own men, their supporters, who are also poor and who are living in Lagere. But these demands were ignored by the slum board, and they were very upset about this. This also resonated with some of the older residents in the area who spoke of how their children had to rent homes in Lagere, while outsiders seem to be provided homes right next to them. Women who were politically active in their neighborhoods spoke of how they were entitled to these homes and their children were entitled to these homes by virtue of the fact that they'd spent decades improving services in this area that pretty much built up the area from scratch. And now this seems to be attracting a lot of attention from other slum dwellers who are streaming into this area, especially since now this area has become a part of the Bangalore Municipal Corporation area since 2007. In 2012, in April 2012, this conflict reached its peak, and one of the councillors, accompanied by his men and residents of the quarters who supported him, broke open the locks of empty apartments that had been allotted to other groups. The slum board had already allotted them to other groups in the city. And these groups were again slated for eviction to be moved here. And while newspaper reports put the number at about 250 apartments in an interview with the local slum board officials, he stated that 640 apartments had been occupied. When I arrived for my field research later that year in December, I met a lot of out of the 50 families, a lot of them had actually gotten their children to occupy extra apartments in these buildings. At the first level, this occupation reveals the similarities between citizenship practices and the politics emerging in these new sites of poverty, and similarities with the same sort of politics that takes place in slums and settlements. As Benjamin puts out in his proposition of occupancy urbanism, occupying territories or spaces has always been used by poor groups as a mode of claiming access to land within the city, therefore defying the state's attempt to plan the city and also subverting formal law. At a second level, the use of occupation within Lagere, defying the slum board's planned allotments, seem to indicate more than just a claim of land. Interviews with people who occupied these homes revealed claims to a neighborhood into which their individual and collective labors were invested. This reclamation of neighborhoods in the face of a state that is reluctant to cede control is instructive as it reveals the political opportunities available to the rehabilitated poor to reclaim their home. At this point, I want to end by just putting in just this one point that when I talk about subversion of laws in my book, I do place them within the broader context of illegalities in the city, both the illegalities of the rich and the wealthy, as well as the illegalities of the state itself. Now, just a last sneak peek into some of the other chapters in my book to tempt you to buy my book or to read it in your libraries. My third chapter deals with mobilizations for rehabilitation housing. I am focusing particularly on urban poor networks and organizations in Bangalore and their representation of poor groups before the slum board. I explore the fuzzy boundaries between the state and these mediators, and the manner in which urban poor networks and organizations that were originally set up or originally conceived to form a radical challenge or to resist the state, over time seem to have been co-opted. My fourth chapter examines gender and the performative politics of the poor. Here I examine everyday politics and the political labors women put into their neighborhoods that's often not visible. I propose that what we see women doing or performing is a political work of some sort that is integral in the development of neighborhoods and in the improvement of the lives of the people in Lagere. I also examine the employment of gendered strategies in protests and their role in influencing discretion, the discretionary powers of state officials, and in evoking state paternalism at various points in time. Finally, in a fifth and last chapter, I look at the documenting practices of the urban poor, looking at how they engage in proof making of various sorts, mimicking legal modes of evidencing, even while these documents, both original and fake, gain validity within sets of social and political relations. With this, I come to an end to this presentation, and I look forward to questions and comments. I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Kaveri. So we do have some questions. I think the first one, I think, is a clarificatory question on just if you could just go sort of re-explain what you mean by the rehabilitated poor. I think that was not well understood. So maybe we could start with that, and then there are different directions of questions we can go to.
Okay. So the rehabilitated poor, essentially, these are groups that are evicted from slums and settlements, and these may be slums that are either notified or not notified, right? As we know in India, the slum board doesn't notify all the slums for obvious reasons, because then it becomes, it becomes liable, or rather responsible, to provide services in these areas, as well as to control any sort of overcrowding or construction in these areas. And so slum boards actually don't notify all of these slums and settlements, but on the other hand are also very keen to remove these people from plots of land, either for developmental works of various sorts. It could be the metro, for instance, in the Bangalore metro project, saw a lot of people being removed from plots of land because the metro lines were to be set up there. Or it could be for the simple reason that this is, clearance of a park which was meant to, which was assigned to be a public park. So by rehabilitated poor, I am talking of people who have been evicted or vacated from other plots of land in the city to make way for other development projects, to then be provided housing in the peripheries of the city. And here again, my sense of rehabilitated, the way in which I use it here, is really rehabilitation to the peripheries. So my field research is not with those who have been provided in situ rehabilitation. So that's the manner in which I use the term in this book.
All right. Partho, do you want to start with your question, since it's quite substantive? And then maybe we can move to Aprajita and Sayali after that.
Sure. Okay.
Those three, and
am I audible?
Yes.
Right. Kaveri, was just wondering, based on your description of how the people in the resettlement colony were being, the relationship between the slum board and the resettlement colony, is how much of this is an issue of institutional culture? In the sense that the slum board deals with slum dwellers qua slum dwellers. And then when they move the same people to a different space, do they keep continuing dealing with them in the same way? Vis-a-vis, let us say, if they were part of a Karnataka housing board scheme, which essentially moved people into LIG or even EWS housing, would somehow the relationship between the housing agency and the residents be somehow different? I mean, have you any sort of work or even sort of anecdotal or other evidence that might sort of indicate that, let us say, people in EWS housing, the housing board kind of structure, have a different kind of experience of the state, which is much less, not so much differentiated. You're whimsical, than the kind of relationship they have with the slum board.
Yes. This is a really good question, and this is also something that I was quite keen to understand, because not very far away from this slum board, not very far away from the slum board quarters, was another area where there was housing provided by the KHP. But again, this was housing which was provided in the 1980s. And it was much better condition. The buildings were much better than the buildings that were provided by the slum board. But I didn't really, pursue that that line of research. But I think it's a very important question to ask. In my own research and in writing up all of this and also situating Lagere within the context of rehabilitation housing projects taking place in other parts of the country as well as in other parts of Bangalore, I have relied primarily on Lalita Kamat's work as well as on Mukhopadhyay's work, for instance, right? And there again, you see similar patterns emerging there, meaning that you see the same sort of problems in terms of lack of access to services, and you see similar issues that I saw in Lagere. But to answer whether this would be different for a KHB project vis-a-vis a KSDB project, I must say I don't have an answer to that because I haven't studied a KHB project. But that would be a very interesting research to carry out, because as you know, in Bangalore, it's not just the KHB, but also the municipality, the municipal corporation itself provides for some of this housing. Kamath and Vijay Bhaskar have also done some amount of research on these rehabilitation projects, but they're looking at at how that entire resettlement took place rather than looking at what happens after the resettlement, and that would be a very good question to ask, whether it is really just something that we see happening with the slum board, or is this more generalized elsewhere as well in other rehabilitation projects.
Thanks, Kaveri. When it comes to the slum board, I wanted to interject a couple of my own questions before we move on, because they were about the slum board. You said something about the slum board recirculating the stock.
Yes.
So how do they do that? How do they repossess units? And especially when there is already a grey market in operation. This really intrigued me because this repossession of stock is always such an issue. So, I mean, it suggests that there's a very high level of control of the slum board. So that was the first question. And the second one was really what's happening in the interim period between demolition and reconstruction to the allottees who are already living in units. So
very good questions. Thank you.
Question.
Thanks for asking. Thanks for asking. Very good questions. And I wanted to also do that, talk a little bit about that. And I thought it will come at the question answer session. So what they, this circulating the stock of the house is also very closely linked to the corruption, as you might imagine, because if there is somebody who has purchased a house or rented a house from an allottee who has been absent from the area, the Karnataka Slum Board recognizes that as a rental agreement or a rental arrangement, and they inquire into how long that rental arrangement has taken place. And if this is an absentee landlord who is no longer collecting the rent anymore, at some point that also happens. Normally they collect rents for a few years, and at some point they forget and they don't collect those rents anymore. So at that point, then the slum board sort of agrees to provide this housing, re-allot this housing to the person who has rented the house. And here again, there is an exchange of money. I mean, obviously money has to exchange hands and you can't get that, free of cost. So that takes place. Similarly, with purchase agreements, somebody has purchased it from somebody who had a medical distress or had some emergency and needed the money, and they have some document of some sort, and very frequently they're mimicking the state, right? I mean, they will come out with stamp papers of various sorts, and they will come out with a proper, legal format of a rental agreement and stamp paper on which these so-called sale deeds take place. Of course, under formal law, they are not recognized because policy law prohibits it. You can't; they are illegal documents. But even this is recognized by the slum board. So the slum board actually and also selectively recognizes it. Depending on the willingness of people to pay for that, and they use the term regularize, and again, we know how regularization, even for the wealthier, more property classes, take place now. In most states are coming out with regularization laws. But this is what happens even in the case of allotments. There is a regularization of these allotments. And so you can regularize that allotment constantly. Okay, you have somebody now, but maybe that person will leave or put somebody else, in a rental position. And at some other point, you're asked to take a call. So the stock is continuously replenished. But what also happens is that frequently even the rehabilitated poor, those who have evicted, are also replaced by people who are not necessarily rehabilitated, people who are looking for affordable housing and therefore rent a house in Lagere. So it's a mix of both people who have been evicted and rehabilitated, and those who come in looking for affordable housing, either to purchase or to rent it. The second question I forgot.
What happens between the reconstruction happens?
They are normally provided, transitory housing, which is actually next to nothing. It's just these sheets, asbestos sheets, 4 or 5 sheets, which have been, put together pretty much. And there's nothing. There are no services. There's absolutely nothing. So a lot of people between the demolition and reconstruction, either rent homes in the vicinity if they can afford it, or if they can't afford it, then they have to rely on this transitory housing. And they are extremely fearful during this period because, at the same time, other allotments are taking place and other people are streaming into their areas. I can give you one instance where one group was waiting for their housing, their building to be constructed, and they were promised that building, and they were living right opposite that building. And suddenly the metro had to evict a group of people. So the slum board overnight took a decision that instead of giving it to these people, let us give it to the metro rehabilitation. So it's a very flexible info, and it was overnight, pretty much overnight. One morning they just woke up and they saw the people who had already been brought in and given the homes right in front of their eyes, right? So they are also fearful, right? The moment they get into transition housing, the moment they vacate, their fears and anxieties actually grow, because then there's so much flexibility in allocations and allotments that they see happening in front of them. They become very, very anxious.
Thanks. Aprajita, do you want to ask, and then Sayali after that? Sayali, I'll just give you unmute you, but Aprajita can ask.
Thanks. It's just a minor question about the role of coercion here. Is it who's setting the degrees of illegalities? And so the more illegal, the lesser chances you have of getting rehabilitative housing or any kind of housing. And just a tangential question about what are these household sizes? What are the rehabilitated housing, the more concrete ones, not the temporary ones?
Yeah.
What kind of families are they going to house?
Yeah. Normally, these are very, very small houses. I think about, 25, 200 and, 50 square feet, right? Very, very tiny houses, pigeonhole apartments, which house between 6 to 8 members. Maximum I've seen about 8 members, not more than that. And these are also, homes which are now, I must also add that the construction quality of the homes has improved. So under the NARM project, for instance, they have come out with this prefabricated blocks, which they say are much more stronger and more resilient. And so those homes are a little bigger, slightly bigger, and slightly better than the older homes which were being constructed with brick and concrete. Did I answer your question? Did I leave out any bit of it?
And I just had a question about who gets to be what happens to the poorest of the poor, or the ones who are most illegal. Let's say the recent evictions from the railway land in Delhi. Like they are evictions that happen overnight, sudden. I know that's not your area of
Yeah, yeah.
research, but what are the chances of them getting rehabilitated quickly, or
Okay,
are they just going to be
okay,
like left on their own?
okay. So again, I mean, I found it so interesting that, you know, in Bangalore, we have this, there is a network of urban poor organizations called Slum Janandolana. So this group is very active. Initially, they were started by a retired professor from St. Joseph's, who had this idea of bringing together urban poor groups in the city to form a sort of a coalition and to pretty much in cases like this, right, overnight eviction, to be able to go to the spot and help these people find housing. So this group gets activated in these kinds of really highly vulnerable situations. But again, once again, you know, the idea with which this network was started out was that the poor help other poor groups. That, you know, essentially there is a solidarity amongst the poor, and they come together against the state and they resist the state. And earlier, from what I heard from many of the activists, is that they would resist eviction. They would firmly resist eviction, and they would find all the means possible to get that group to stay put, primarily because it's displacement, right? I mean, it's loss of jobs, it's pretty much restarting your lives, and pretty much, you know, groups which have actually built up slums and, you know, built up the services in these slums have to restart that process in some other part of the city. But later you see that these groups have also sort of become very co-opted. They've been co-opted by the state and state officials in a very interesting way, through corruption primarily, right? It's just that, you know, we will allow you, these organizations are sustained by the voluntary work of different poor groups. So some of them would be provided a stipend or a fellowship by, you know, Slum Janasahyog, which was the organization which was supporting this. But then what happened was they needed other people to volunteer help, and the people who volunteered help would at some point begin to claim homes for themselves. They'd say, well, I'm helping so many people get homes. Can't you add me in the list and get me an extra home? So this sort of started the cycle of bloating lists, right? And in which obviously the state officials are complicit. So what you see now is pretty much a machinery in place in Bangalore, where the moment you have groups like this, highly vulnerable groups, you have these people land up and, you know, first come, first serve, meaning if I'm there first, I'm the mediator, no one else. So there's an arrangement and, you know, an agreement between them that other leaders can't step in once this group has elected me, right? So they are your clientele. And then you will pretty much, as a mediator, you know, sort of convince them to accept rehabilitation. And of course, then, you know, you have the vacation of these people. You know that not everybody is going to get housing. Many of them will be left with nothing. And those of them who get housing then land up in places like this. So the most marginal, most vulnerable people are also, therefore, in a certain sense, sought by these leaders. So let me give you one example. There was a eunuch leader of a group which was living on, in fact, on a highway road. You know, they weren't even in a slum or settlement. They were living on the pavement of a large highway. And he spoke about how one of these leaders approached him to, you know, help them out to get homes, and how he pretty much drove that leader out, right? He chased him out of the slum. He said, there are a lot of leaders like you who come and promise and take money from us and don't do anything. So that entire urban poor machinery, that's the urban poor struggles themselves have become sort of part of this, you know, strategic or tactical displacement of the poor, in which these people have also become now, you know, chinks in that that machinery that enables rehabilitation housing.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mukta. You know, thanks for asking. This is a very Aprajita, sorry. Thanks for asking, because that's a very important part of this book, is to look at these networks and these organizations.
Okay.
historically also to trace their trajectory and see what is happening today.
Okay, thank you.
You also in those answers actually responded to what Isabel had left on the chat, which was also a question around
Yes, yes.
mobilization, and she had left before you clarified during your talk that that's another chapter in the
Yes,
book.
yeah.
But I think some part of this, some part of her question has also been addressed. Sayali,
Yeah.
do you want to ask yours? It's a little bit of a different track, and then Pushpa. Then
Sure,
Pushpa. Yeah.
sure. Thank you so much, Professor Haritas. This was a great session and really appreciate the depth that you have achieved in your research on this particular topic of rehabilitation and resettlement. I had a very broad question, and maybe this comes in your book in the later chapters, maybe in your recommendations or solutions that you are recommending. But just wanted to hear from you up close on what are some of the positive changes that you wish to see in such colonies and such resettlement projects. Because I'm asking you this question because there are a lot of issues, right? And they're very complex, very layered issues. But is there something in particular that your research hopes to address, basis which there are concrete recommendations to the state or to practitioners that
Yes,
they can
yeah.
use in their work? Yeah.
I think I would start with the first, note, which I made during the presentation, which is that we need a far more equitable distribution of land. In Bangalore, as you know, we have vast tracts of land that have been reserved for, the jobs of the rich, the corporate economies of the city. And on the other hand, you see, very little land which is provided for housing the poor, despite the fact that they pretty much construct our cities. Without them, our cities would not be here. We would not have roads. We would not have the infrastructure that we have. And I think that is really the idea. That is really one suggestion that I think is the most important one, which is that we need to begin to look at a far more equitable distribution of land to poor groups, to weaker sections and low-income groups, because that is essentially creating the very problem that you're trying to solve. The second thing that I would say is that if you were to look at these rehabilitation areas, right? I mean, if you look at the amount of state resources that go into maintaining these areas, you're spending a lot of money to keep those, maintain those houses, demolish those houses, reconstruct them. Of course, you have some amount of housing stock on your hand, but is it really worth all of this, right? Wouldn't the solution be a more equitable distribution of land itself, rather than to sort of try to solve the problem of the slum and then recreate the slum elsewhere in the margins of the city? So that is what I find very paradoxical and very confusing. And Sayari, thanks for this question, because it also reminds me of something. That one of these urban poor activists told me. This urban poor organization that I study in my book is also a Dalit organization. So he told me how essentially that these lands on which Lagere is situated were actually wastelands, which were reclaimed by the city during after the Urban Land Ceilings Act, right? These were lands on which you could not cultivate anything. Right. They were hilly areas, up and down areas, essentially wasteland of various sorts, which was given away then to the state by the owners. And this land is now, therefore, housing the poor. And the caste angle to it was that he said that, the state actually does this on purpose. They want to keep us here. There is no other reason why we are provided housing here so far away from the city. We are taken away, we are thrown away once we are no longer required in the city. So there is also a sense from these urban poor groups of being excluded from the exploits of the city, from the wealth of the city, right? So I think some serious thought really needs to go into it. And despite the fact that housing is under the directive principles of state policy and not fundamental rights, there has to be some concerted action taken to address these feelings of exclusion by such a large population. Our cities are at least about 30%, comprised of these people, whereas the land that is allocated to them is very little. So when it comes to housing these people, the state very conveniently says there is no land, whereas you have large tracts of land which are allocated in your planning instruments towards the wealthier segments in society, towards housing them, towards the corporate offices that you expect will be constructed in these areas. I think we have to really seriously rethink the way in which we treat the urban poor, and that is really the attempt of this book, is to ask some really very fundamental questions. Are we really saving a lot of money, or are we actually sort of, spending a lot more state resources where lesser could have done, right? I mean, are we really financially also, are these models really financially viable? Because then these are generations and generations of the rehabilitated poor who become dependent. And then they become embroiled in relations of dependence, which means they will never get out of poverty. They will still stay in that particular mindset of depending on the state. And that is something I think that the state needs to avoid. It has to find a way to make these people independent. And one way of doing this is to equitably to look at allocation far more equitably than it does at the moment.
Great.
Kaveri,
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ali. That's actually a great segue into Pushpa's question, which is taking you to the other end of the spectrum. And you alluded to aspirations of living in better areas of the city, etc. Pushpa, why don't you come on and ask?
I have unmuted. I don't know how
Yes,
to make
we can
myself.
Hear you.
We can hear you.
I can make myself visible. I don't know how to make myself
no,
visible.
I think I can't do that. I unmuted you. That's as far as this technology is allowing me.
Kaveri, very, very important contribution made by your work. But you have answered some of the questions which I already have in mind. But your last statement about why the state spends so much money and not make more land availability, equitable land availability to the poor, which may be more sustainable in the long run. And I think my question is quite related. And I was struck by your statement that many of these slum dwellers have desire to live in decent areas, which indicates their desire for upward mobility and mainstreaming. This is what most of us, this is great, and this is what most of us development professionals would like seeing happening as process of people moving out of slums, living in regular houses, being mainstreamed, and slums being phased out. Why do we have slums in our country for still 70 years? And we still are doing slum upgrading programs.
Yes.
So, what I meant was that this is socio-economic mobility with more incomes and more affordable formal housing being created. So we are talking about, in general, broader land and labor market and land and housing markets. These are bigger questions, and you are touching upon some of these questions, which I think is very, very important. But going back to your study, and you have studied this settlement for 15 years, out of the 15...
For 6 years.
No, 2009. Oh, sorry, 6 years.
6
Okay.
years. 6
But
years.
but you would be familiar with the historical information on many of these households.
Yeah, yeah.
Were there any incidents of any members of these families moving out of these resettled areas to normal, regular housing, either rented or owned?
Yes, yes.
Oh, very interesting.
Yes.
Please share.
I want to, there were actually 4 cases of people, 4 people who I interviewed. Out of these 4 people, 2 people were staff in NGOs working in the area. And one of them is so interesting because she lived in the area, she studied in the local school in the area, which is really very, very poorly, provided for. And she went on to do her educate. She actually worked as well as studied in an evening college. She and then passed out and then joined the NGO as a staff of the NGO. And was earning a pretty decent salary. And she told me how the first thing that she wanted to do when she got her salary was to, because it was her mother and her sister and her, the first thing she wanted to do was to move her family out of this house. But yes, there were 4 cases of people, and 2 of them were garment factory workers who eventually left the area, and both of them, the garment factory owners actually, I found were quite, they were focused on getting out. They were not focused on what was happening within the area. So they did not take too much part in any of the political mobilizations or the struggles within it. All their focus was on, how do we get out of this place and how do we live in a decent area. So those 2 families purchased small plots of land on the Pina Road close by and moved out of the area. So there have been these examples.
I think that's great. So 4 families,
4
2
families, yeah.
out by buying, and 2 you said supported by NGOs.
Two who went on to work with NGOs. One of them was very highly educated. Like I said, she finished her college, she finished her pre-university as well as a degree. The other one was still doing her pre-university. She had not yet completed her degree, but she had also been hired by a local NGO. So she also moved her family out of the area.
But they provided housing, the NGOs?
No. They rented there because with the
so
salary of an NGO, they were
Okay.
Yes.
So
but nearby, these are not very expensive houses. They are, I think if I'm right, if I remember right, this girl who was doing her PUC when I met her had a house which costed her some 3,000 rupees, and just like immediately outside, Bidan Sauda layout, just immediately outside Lakere. Again, a very tiny house, but of course, she said it's a decent area, and there is water and electricity, and
So 2 rented and 2 purchased.
Yes.
In terms of number of residents, So sorry.
No, I mean, this is clearly a long set of questions that you have, and maybe we can connect you separately with Kaveri. Pushpa is also a visiting fellow with CPR, and offline for I'm sure, fascinating discussion on this. Danish actually has a quick reflection before I move to Veronique. He's saying, I'm not sure to what degree the Indian middle class is a supporter of coexisting with the poor. Segregation and distancing themselves from the poor is seen as an acceptable social trait by many. And a stepping stone for advocacy by the wealthier for the poor would be an assurance of higher wages for the poor who already work for them. So he's making
I agree. I agree that higher wages have to be provided, but people need a place to stay. They need a home. And that's where I think the state has to come in. The state has to, relook, because I think if that's the other thing that I want to point out is that I was searching, I've been searching all these years for data on the amount of land which has been allocated to EWS and LIG, and you don't find that, right? You don't find these. Even if you were to take just the city of Bangalore, if I could say, okay, it has so many million hectares of land, and out of this X number of hectares are house the middle income groups, X number you don't have these statistics, and then therefore you don't really, the only way in which you see this disparity is in the slums and settlements that mushroom around you. So we need that data. We need also some, perhaps, people who can get together and cull in, because there is data from different institutions, for instance, and annual data through annual reports. And maybe that data has to be brought together to really take a look at how much land has been allocated to the poor. And that's where I think,
yeah, I think
we can
that
have a good assessment.
This particular aspect which you're pointing out right now is a bread and butter of a lot of participative planning, master plan and other development plan related conversations which happened in Bangalore, Bombay, now happening in Delhi. So very much land reservation is on that. It never gets addressed, but it's always on the list of demands.
On the list.
Veronique, please go ahead. Yeah. Over to you.
So since I have the privilege to read the full book before it is published, I don't have a specific question because I found that. But what I would like to underline is why I was reading it, it really resonates with many of the trends of processes, of practices that I could observe during my own research in Delhi resettlement colonies, in the Katputi colony resettlement rehabilitation plan, which also involves this transient accommodation. And I think the term citizen people in limbo or citizen in limbo will very much apply also to the condition of these people. It also resonates with what I could observe in the resettlement flats in Chennai. And what I would like to, to encourage Haza to read your book, that not only you go in a very in-depth case studies and anthropological studies, but you also really engage with many theoretical debates. So this is very also enriching for the readers. So
I must say I'm blessed. There is so much theoretical richness on these issues, and so I'm really blessed in that sense also to have that material to be able to discuss this terrain. Thank you.
So I look forward to have the real book.
Yes, it's going to be posted as soon as it is out. Yeah.
So thanks a lot.
Yeah.
So any last comments from folks on the panel? As in folks who don't need me to unmute them, or anybody else who wants to jump in just needs to put their hand up. Christine, do you want to say something? You can just talk.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead. Yes, please. You're welcome.
Hello, Kaveri. It was so good to hear you, to listen to you, and to follow your reflections and to see how much you have deepened your theoretical questions since the dissertation. I really very much would encourage you to continue this longitudinal study. As I put in my comment, it would be interesting to compare with another friend and colleague who did for 40 years that same sort of investigation in the poor neighborhoods of Lima, and asked herself how, under what conditions and how can people living in those conditions extract themselves from poverty. And become real subjects of rights. And I think that is more the theoretical questions that you are touching also. How can you, I remember during our visits also to the field and discussions and so all these years, that you presented a situation, a real jungle of institutions that make it so complicated to people to really claim their rights, that it seems almost impossible to claim the rights because it's so complex, and it is made by purpose complex. I mean, that is something that you had said also. And I think these things are really particularly important in these times. And I wanted only to, I have a lot of questions, but we can do that personally, but I would encourage you to continue that study and to try to see on the long, for a long duration, how that situation can or does change or not. How do groups of women constitute themselves as of subjects of rights or not, as you investigated also in another study that we did together with women fishers, and is it really possible or not, or is the situation constructed in such a way that it is just impossible? It's made impossible to become a right holder in these situations, which is a bit what I feel when I, what I felt when I read your dissertation, and what I feel that you have now, that you have continued your reflections, that it is such a complex and such a jungle that you cannot get out of that limbo, as you say, which is a very interesting analysis also. So unfortunately, I have the impression that we cannot be very optimistic from your readings, although there is so much mobilization and activism and political work from all these groups of women and women. So, but I have the impression that it gives us something like a negative impression at the end, that structurally it seems very complicated. But I wanted to answer that, to put that question, if you feel that we should be as pessimistic as I feel, or if you think that we can be, we can have some rays of hope.
Thanks, Christine. I mean, this reminds me of our, how you visited me pretty much on the field, and all these conversations that we had at that time, which got me going. Because as you can imagine, doing this kind of work, at one point, I think I also told you that it was weighing very heavy on me, because I was also very emotionally, brought down by what I saw. And I think I went through a pretty bad phase at one point, because I just felt that there seemed to be really no way out. Once you're in, you're stuck. It's a little bit like a trap, and then you just can't get out. And what you say also resonated with me, because there are many other people also who talk about it in that way. Many of the people from within like Gere, who talked about how once you're here, and there's no way of getting out of this mess, and so you sort of deal with that mess. You negotiate and get the best out of it as far as possible. So yes, I mean, this is perhaps the hardest question to answer, and I would once again like to go back to some theoretical material here to answer this. When I contrast some of these, the way in which people talk about their lives of feeling trapped in this place, and then I look at literature that sort of celebrates the politics of the poor. I'm referring to some of them, for example, Appadurai, who's rather quite positive about it. I mean, he talks about passive waiting and active waiting, and and I feel there is a tendency. I think we also, as human beings, we want to feel that that there is something improving in the lives of the poor, and we perhaps also sort of tend to see it where it does not exist. And that is something that I've sort of questioned myself about. Am I thinking there is a possibility here because I want to feel good that these people are perhaps have an opportunity or a way out? And I think that is what I've sought to do in this book, is to say that yes, there are certain opportunities available, but within those larger restrictions. That you are pretty much restrained within a certain territory and a certain space and a certain set of actions that you can take. And there, within those sets of actions, then you have some amount of agency. But this is not unlimited agency. And this is definitely, we cannot deny the fact that that what these people are living through is very, very hard. one of the people, for instance, told me that, this is, once they bring us in places like this, there is no way of escaping poverty. Now we are stuck in poverty for the rest of our lives. Our children will be poor and their children will be poor, right? So that is what I've sort of tried to balance. And there's a lot of work, for instance, Holston, who looks at insurgent citizenship. And it's a little bit too positive for me, because when you look at those conditions and when you meet these people and you realize that even those opportunities that people talk about are still within certain constraints, then you realize that opportunity for action is restricted and it is not unlimited, and that it is perhaps not a good thing to see hope where there isn't, right? And to sort of realize that perhaps that there are certain things that are just not possible for them. So this has actually been also quite a difficult bit, because I remember when I was doing this ethnography, at the same time I was struggling for housing in Switzerland. Christine Verschur knows how I've struggled for a house just to rent, right? To even to get a house to rent in Switzerland, in Geneva is next to impossible. And towards the end, towards the middle of my PhD research, I was given an asylum, a subsidized rental housing by the state. Now, this is, asylum is essentially for, people who are economically constrained in Switzerland. It's not for rich people. And so at various points of time, I asked myself, this was an excellent house right in the middle of the city, hardly 5 minutes away from the Graduate Institute. And the Swiss government was providing extremely cheap housing to a student from the Graduate Institute who would otherwise categorize as poor in the Swiss system, right? And it therefore opened up so many opportunities for me and allowed me to actually, compare myself to everybody else. I didn't feel excluded. I didn't feel like I was poor, right? It was proper housing. It was extremely decent housing, very well located, right in the middle of the city, very close to the UN, very close to Graduate Institute. So each time I would come back to Lagere and look at this, I would, it was extremely unsettling, because on the one hand, you see the possibilities for doing something like this. For instance, just to be able to provide these people in situ housing rather than to resettle them would substantially improve their lives. They would retain their jobs. They would not have to, deepen their poverty. So I think that is really something that I've struggled with in this book, is to be very aware that so much of these theorizations of urban poor politics are rather extremely positive, and that one needs to be skeptical of these so-called, unlimited opportunities that these poor have, and their and the strengths also, the unlimited strengths the poor have to be able to answer everything. And we need to be a little pragmatic and understand that there are huge limitations and huge constraints to this sort of resistance. Thanks, Christine. Thanks for that question.
Thanks for you.
Both Marie-Hélène and Partho has raised his hand for a while now, but Marie-Hélène says that now that you've said this, she has stuff to say. So, Partho, should we ask Marie-Hélène to go first, since it's in response to Kaveri?
Yes, absolutely. I would also sort of be happy to have questions from attendees if they have any.
All right, can you hear me?
Currently, I think there are not any from the attendees. Yes, we can, Marie-Hélène.
Yeah, okay, my question, I quite agree with you, Kaveri. I think about, at times, maybe the glorification of agency of the poor. I wonder whether Holston's position is also coming from the kind of sites he's looking at. And for instance, if you look at Brazil, during the Lula's time, there was really a major impetus.
Yes.
And that took many people out of poverty. Of course, now the situation is very different, but that also means that this ability to bring people out of poverty comes out from larger political movement and the ability of social movements to connect to the politics of it. So my question would be that we don't see this in India in many ways. And did you look at maybe the various posture of political parties in Karnataka and more specifically in Bangalore? Because I think if this connect does not happen, I agree with you. I mean, it's very highly romanticized.
Yes, yeah. Yes, I mean, Holston's field is completely different from the field that I'm looking at. I mean, Holston is talking about auto construction, and it's obviously located in a political context that is completely different from the context that I am talking about, where you see that these Dalit politics are able to go only so far and no further. And there are these set alliances between Dalit groups, which are also, these are the groups actually in Bangalore that are very active on urban poor housing. And there are these set political alliances with certain political parties, which seem to have very little in relation to their real conditions of life and their demands for a decent life. So you see that disconnect in the sense that these political affiliations remain political affiliations without any addressal of the needs of the groups that sustain these alliances. The other day I was actually also listening into a recent book discussion on Manthan. I forgot the name of the author, where he is also examining this question of marginalization and the mobilization of the most marginalized. I think that's the name of the book. And it's a discussion with Professor Pratap Bhanu Mehta. And he also says the same thing, is that on the one hand, you see that the same sort of questions keep arising over and over again. You have caste-based violence, you have this kind of exclusion and discrimination. And the reason I bring up also this caste question is that you see that the majority of the people living in these rehabilitation areas, and majority of so many of these slums are either Dalit or Muslim, right? So you see that there is a failure to connect the political agenda with the real demands or the real needs of these people. And then these political alliances just sort of remain political alliances without addressing the needs of these people. And yes, this sort of, this sort of exploration of the agency of the poor when situated within these political contexts, it is good. But on the other hand, does that really, the question that I would like to ask is that, does that in any way change when there is a change in political context, right? I mean, you talk about Lula, for instance. Are these people really able to claim the same kind of rights even now, without the same political configuration they had earlier? And are they able to sustain, therefore, these rights over long periods of time? Because if they are not, then what are we talking about? We are talking about, probably, opportunities which are specific to certain periods of time, but not at others. And therefore, then are these rights that these people can actually claim or demand from the state? And that's where I find a problem. That, if you're still in the realm of negotiating, of course, you have that lawfare, the use of lawfare in Holston's field, right? The use of the law against the state. And that's even in India, you see that. You see urban poor groups constantly approaching courts of law to challenge or resist an eviction. But when this is not couched in the law itself, or there is no language of rights that is provided, but it is more of a situational negotiation or, these kind of, situational agreements which are made later to be destroyed, then there is a serious problem with this. So yes, I mean, my answer is yes, I totally agree with you that it's the political context in each situation that determines it. But if that political context were to change, can people still claim this? And that is where I think that, there is some possibility or probability of some amount of rights for the poor if that were possible.
Thanks, Kaveri. Partho,
Thanks.
do you want to come in now?
Sure. Actually, so Kaveri, just to sort of take this question a little further. So one of the issues. So first, one of the issues, I think, in Brazil, it's arguable that the PT, especially in Sao Paulo, remains a strong political force, even if they're not in power at particular points in time. And therefore, the demonstration of possibility that was brought about during the period which then led to the city and so on, is something that has a certain half-life. What the decay rate is something else we will find out. But in the context of Bangalore specifically, and since you spoke of Amit's book and that structure, therefore,
yes,
where do you see let's say my conversations with some of the members of the group that you spoke about, the impression is, I mean, not the impression, the narrative is that these relocations are very similar to the putting Dalits in their place. But just like in villages, Dalits have their own place and
yes,
a settlement of their own. They should have a place of their own, but they're not part of the city. In the same way, they're not part of the village. They're also not part of the city. So this is almost seen as a continuation of the casteist practices. And consequently, but not really in that sense articulated as such, because I don't think any political party, except perhaps in the North to some extent, actually still sort of uses caste as I mean, there are lots of ways in which caste is used, the lingayats and the structures, but just the Dalit, non-Dalit story
yes,
is not something that is used as a axis of political mobilization. And it's in that context did you hear that narrative when you were doing your work? And
yes,
in that context, what would be your impression? And this goes also to Christine's question about pessimism and optimism,
yes,
about the possibility of such mobilization happening. Where do you see that the things that are pulling back that mobilization, and what do you see as things that are actually pushing forward that mobilization?
Okay, so the interesting thing is that if you're looking at a slum or a settlement at the level of the slum, the moment there is a possibility of rehabilitation housing, it already divides the slum, right? So it divides the slum between those who are eligible for rehabilitation and those who are not eligible. So at the very beginning, policies of rehabilitation tend to already divide people even within the slum. Now, I've worked very closely. I interviewed the one particular urban poor organization, which is very active in this sort of localized struggles. And what they told me was that we have two names. We have a Dalit name to our organization, but we also have an urban poor name. And the reason we have that is that there are also non-Dalits in in need of home. And therefore we mobilize these groups too, right? And these groups are essentially, sort of oscillating between their Dalit identity as well as their poor identity. So even at the level of identity, in terms of caste identity, they are actually balancing both. Now, this group also organizes a lot of these training sessions and education sessions to children of Dalits, teaching them about Ambedkar. There are, classes which they organize to discuss the constitution. There are movie showings that they organize to sort of spread this Dalit awareness and to sort of, keep people aware of these issues amongst the Dalits, amongst those people, of course, who propound a Dalit identity, rather a mobilization or a rather, activist identity. But on the other hand, they're also very careful to balance it and to say that, if you're talking about the poor in Bangalore, then we are all Dalits. So even if it is somebody who is from a Muslim caste, he is also Dalit by virtue of being excluded from land within the city. He also is going to be thrown here in the housing along with us. So there is also on that other side, just like you see in movements outside, that there is an attempt by these organizations to sort of solidify, unify, bring under the Dalit fold other identities too, which are not necessarily, outcast identities. So that takes place at that level. But then in terms of translating that into political power at the city level, there is a huge dilemma, and that does not take place. It doesn't translate. For instance, I'm just again now quoting off an interview. This I haven't discussed in my book per se, but I'd be very happy to share this interview with you. It's a life history interview that I made of this Dalit leader, and he spoke about how there are certain Dalit politicians who came up to power in Karnataka, and they did nothing for the Dalit cause. They actually deceived all the Dalits. They gained all of this political power, and then the moment you become part of the state, the moment you begin to talk the language of the state, you forget your caste identity. So there is also there is that is pretty much taking place, which doesn't allow these groups to Dalit groups to unify and come out with a sort of a very strong political presence at the city level. But what also is taking place is that on the other hand, you have urban poor networks. So there is a sort of a unionization or a sort of an organization of poor groups who are in touch with each other. They are trying very hard to find housing for various groups in the city. But even at that level, there is no solidarity, and there is no possibility for a unified voice. The reason, once again, one of it is this whole, the state providing very little bits, very few numbers of housing when there is so much demand already, then divides the entire, then everybody gets into this logic of who's going to get this house, and then there is attention drawn away from the larger, more radical radical political organization. So there is no possibility for that. And then there are differences between these leaders. So there are several Dalit leaders in the city who are very, very well known, and they all have their own groups. So this leader, for instance, told me, I have about 200 slums that I take care of in the city. So each leader has his or her own, space that he or she sort of commands and sort of controls. And then this ultimately becomes, goes into a logics of which leader can get more houses from the state vis-a-vis the other leader. So the entire, there is no, as one of the lawyers told me, for instance, he said, we were thinking, and this was a lawyer who was working earlier with the Alternative Law Forum. And he said the idea was that we would build this coherent urban poor struggle that could sort of come together and challenge the state. And I'm now, also referring to a colleague of mine, Shweta Rao, who's asked this question in her thesis. Her question is, when there are so many people who are so poor and they can pretty much bring the city to a halt if they want to, if they protest, why aren't they doing it? Why don't we see a social movement? And for this, his answer essentially was that now you've sort of gone into this tangent where you're, clamoring for the few resources that the state has to offer, and you're sort of exchanging silences over corruption, meaning I will keep quiet if you keep quiet. I will bloat the lists and you allot as many homes as I want. And on the other hand, you as a slum official, you take your quotas from it and I will keep quiet. So when you have this sort of relationship that is taking place, there is no possibility for any sort of unified radical struggle or a political movement of sorts. So that movement is largely pretty much co-opted into the logics of the state. And this is what I see happening. And thank Mukta for giving me the name of the author, Amit Ahuja. When he said that, it struck a chord with me as well, because this is what I was seeing, which is what it's a question that I've always been asking. Why is it that we don't see people coming together and standing up against the state when they can do it? They can do it, and they can, bring everything to a standstill if they want to, just like the farmers have in Delhi, right? So why don't we see that movement? And this is perhaps the answer to it, because there are these relations which are now sort of so far away from a radical challenge to the state that it is no longer possible. Partha, I hope I answered your question. Thank you very so much. That's a wonderful, fascinating question. Thank you so much. Thanks. It's just got me thinking. Yes.
Thank you, Kaveri. I think all of the questions have provoked very interesting reflections from you, and we all look forward to the book. Thank you very much for coming and talking to us about it today. And for those who weren't able to attend, we'll have the recording on our website soon, and on the Facebook Live, of course. So thanks a lot, Kaveri, for doing this. And thank you everyone for coming, for sticking till the end of the long session.
Thanks, Mukta, and thanks for those wonderful, invigorating questions. And it makes me want to, push further and read more and write more, and definitely research more. Thank you very much, and I look forward to staying in touch with you, with all of you. Thanks, Christy. Thanks once again for making it. Thank you. Thanks. Bye.